Hey everybody, welcome back to our chapter book read along. We are starting a book, The Borrowers by Mary Norton, and I am excited to get it started with you. So let's get going. The Borrowers by Mary Norton. Chapter 1. Mrs. May lived in 2 rooms in Kate's parents' house in London. She was, I think, some kind of relation. Her bedroom was on the first floor, and her sitting room was a room which, as part of the house, was called the breakfast room. Now, breakfast rooms were all right in the morning when the sun streams in on the toast and marmalade, but by afternoon they seem to vanish a little and to fill with a strange silvery light, their own twilight. There is a kind of sadness in them then, but as a child, it was a sadness Kate liked. She would creep in to Mrs. May just before tea time, and Mrs. May would teach her crochet. Mrs. May was old, her joints were stiff, and she was not strict exactly, but she never had that inner certainty which does instead. Kate was never wild with Mrs. May, or untidy, nor self-willed, and Mrs. May taught her many things besides crochet. How to wind wool in an egg-shaped ball, how to run and fell a plan a darn, how to tidy a drawer and to lay like a blessing above the contents a sheet of rustling tissue against the dust. "Where's your work, child?" asked Mrs. May one day, when Kate sat hunched and silent upon the hassock. "You mustn't sit there dreaming. Have you lost your tongue?" "No," said Kate, pulling her shoe button. "I've lost the crochet hook." They were making a bed quilt in woolen squares. There were 30 still to do. "I don't know where I put it," she went on hastily. "I put it on the bottom shelf of the bookshelf just beside my bed." "On the bottom shelf?" repeated Mrs. May, her own needle flicking steadily in the firelight. "Near the floor?" "Yes," said Kate, "but I looked on the floor, under the rug, everywhere. The wool was still there, though, just where I left it." "Oh dear," exclaimed Mrs. May lightly. "Don't say they're in this house too." "The what are?" asked Kate. "The borrowers," said Mrs. May. In a half light she seemed to smile. Kate started a little fearfully. "Are there such things?" "As what?" "As people, other people living in a house who borrow things?" Mrs. May laid down her work. "What do you think?" she asked. "I don't know," Kate said, pulling hard at her shoe button. "There can't be, and yet," she raised her head, "and yet sometimes I think there must be." "Why do you think there must be?" asked Mrs. May. "Because of all the things that disappear. Safety pins, for instance. Factories go on making safety pins, and every day people go on buying safety pins, and yet somehow there never is a safety pin just when you want one. Where are they all? Now, at this minute, where'd they go to? Take needles," she went on. "All the needles my mother ever bought. There must be hundreds. Can't just be lying about the house." "Not lying about the house, no," agreed Mrs. May. "And all the other things we keep on buying, again and again and again, like pencils and matchboxes and sealing wax and hairpins and drawing pins and thimbles." "And hat pins," put in Mrs. May, "and blotting paper." "Yes, blotting paper," agreed Kate, "but not hat pins." "That's where you're wrong," said Mrs. May, and she picked up her work again. "There's a reason for that, for hat pins." Kate stared. "A reason?" she repeated. "I mean, what kind of reason?" "Well, there are 2 reasons, really. A hat pin is a very useful weapon." Mrs. May laughed suddenly. "But it all sounds such nonsense, and—" she hesitated. "It was so very long ago." "But tell me," said Kate. "Tell me, how do you know about the hat pin? Did you ever see one?" Mrs. May threw her a startled glance. "Well, yes," she began. Not a hat pin, exclaimed Kate impatiently. Whatever you called them, a borrower. Mrs. May drew in a sharp breath. No, she said quickly. I never saw one. But someone else saw one, cried Kate, and you know all about it. I can see you do. Hush, said Mrs. May. No need to shout. She gazed downwards at the upturned face, and then she smiled, and her eyes slid away into the distance. I had a brother, she began uncertainly. Kate knelt upon the hassock. And he saw them. I don't know, said Mrs. May, shaking her head. I just don't know. She smoothed out her work upon her knee. He was such a tease. He told us so many things, my sister and me, impossible things. He was killed, she added gently, many years ago now on the northwest frontier. He became a colonel of his regiment. He died what you call a hero's death. Was he your only brother? Yes, and he was our little brother. I think that was why, she thought for a moment, still smiling to herself. Yes, why he told such impossible stories, such strange imaginings. He was jealous, I think, because we were older and because we could read better. He wanted to impress us. He wanted perhaps to shock us, and yet... She looked into the fire. There was something about him, perhaps because we were brought up in India among mystery and magic and legend, something that made us think that he saw things that other people did not see. Sometimes we know he was teasing, but other times, well, we were not so sure. She leaned forward and, in her tidy way, brushed a fan of loose ashes under the grate. Then, brush in hand, she stared again at the fire. He wasn't a very strong little boy. The first time he came home from India, he got a fever. He missed a whole term at school and was sent away to the country to get over it, to the house of a great aunt. Later, I went there myself. It was a strange old house. She hung up the brush on its brass hook, and dusting her hands on her handkerchief, she picked up her work. Better light the lamp, she said. Not yet, begged Kate, leaning forward. Please go on. Please tell me. But I've told you. No, you haven't. This old house. Wasn't that where he saw... Mrs. May laughed. Where he saw the borrowers? Yes, that's what he told us. What he'd have us believe. And what's more, it seems that he didn't just see them, but he got to know them very well, that he became part of their lives, as it were. In fact, you might almost say that he became a borrower himself. Oh, do please tell me, please. Try to remember right from the very beginning. But I do remember, said Mrs. May. Oddly enough, I remember it better than many real things which I have seen happen. Perhaps it was a real thing. I just don't know. You see, on the way back to India, my brother and I had to share a cabin. My sister used to sleep with our governess, and on very hot nights, often we couldn't sleep. My brother would talk for hours and hours, going over old ground, repeating conversations, telling me details again and again, wondering how they were and what they were doing, and they? Who were they exactly? Homily, Pod, and little Arietti. Pod? Yes, even their names were never quite right. They imagined they had their own names, quite different from human names, but with half an ear you could tell that they were borrowed. Even Uncle Herendiris and Eglintas, everything they had was borrowed. They had nothing of their own at all, nothing. In spite of this, my brother said, they were touchy and conceited, and thought they owned the world. How do you mean? They thought human beings were just invented to do the dirty work, great slaves put here for them to use. At least, that's what they told each other. But my brother said that underneath, he thought they were frightened. It was because they were frightened, he thought, that they had grown so small. Each generation had become smaller and smaller, and more hidden. In the olden days, it seems, in some parts of England, our ancestors talked quite openly about the little people. Yes, said Kate, I know. Nowadays, I suppose, Mrs. May went on slowly. If they exist at all, you would only find them in houses which are old and quiet and deep in the country, and where the human beings live to a routine. Routine is their safeguard. They must know which rooms are to be used and when. They do not stay long where there are careless people, or unruly children, or certain house pets. This particular old house, of course, was ideal, although as far as some of them were concerned, a trifle cold and empty. Great Aunt Sophie was bedridden, though a hunting accident had put her there 20 years before. And as for other human beings, there was only Mrs. Driver, the cook, Crumfrel, the gardener, and, at rare intervals, an odd housemaid and such. My brother, too, when he went there after his fever, had to spend long hours in bed, and for those first weeks, it seems the borrowers did not know of his existence. He slept in the old night nursery beyond the schoolroom. The schoolroom, at that time, was sheeted and shrouded and filled with junk. Odd trunks, a broken sewing machine, a desk, a dressmaker's dummy, a table, some chairs, a disused pianola, as the children who had used it, Great Aunt Sophie's children, had long since grown up, married, died, or gone away. The night nursery opened out of the schoolroom, and from his bed my brother could see the oil painting of the Battle of Waterloo, which was hung above the schoolroom fireplace. And on the wall, a corner cupboard with a glass door in front, and was set out on hooks and shelves. A doll's tea service, very delicate and old. At night, if the schoolroom door was open, he had a view down the lighted passage, which led to the head of the stairs, and it would comfort him to see, each evening at dusk, Mrs. Driver appear at the head of the stairs, cross the passage carrying a tray for Aunt Sophie with Bath Oliver biscuits and a tall cut glass decanter of fine pale Madeira. On her way out, Mrs. Driver would pause and lower the gas jet in the passage to a dim blue flame. Then he would watch her as she stumped away down the stairs, sinking slowly out of sight between the banisters. Under this passage, in the hall below, there was a clock, and through the night he would hear it strike the hours. It was a grandfather clock and very old. Mr. Firth of Linton Buzzard came each month to wind it, as his father had come before him and his great-uncle before that. For 80 years, they said. And to Mr. Firth's certain knowledge, it had not stopped, and as far as anyone could tell, for as many years before that. The great thing was that it must never be moved. It stood against the wainscot, and the stone flags around it had become washed so often that a little platform, my brother said, rose up inside. And under this clock, below the wainscot, there was a hole. Chapter 2. It was Pod's hole, the keep of his fortress, the entrance to his home. Not that his home was anywhere near the clock, far away from it, as you might say. There were yards of dark, dusty passageway, with wooden doors between the joints, and metal gates against the mice. Pod used all kinds of things for these gates. A flat leaf of folding cheese grater, the hinged lid of a small cash box, squares of pierced zinc from an old meat safe, a wire fly swatter. Not that I'm afraid of mice, Homily would say, but I can't abide the smell. In vain Arrietty had begged for a little mouse of her own, a blind mouse to bring up by hand, like Aglatina had had. But Homily would bang with the pan lids and exclaim, "And look what happened to Aglatina!" "What?" Arrietty would ask. "What happened to Aglatina?" But no one would ever say. It was only Pod who knew the way through the intersecting passages to the hole under the clock, and only Pod could open the gates. There were complicated clasps made of hairpins and safety pins, of which Pod alone knew the secret. His wife and child led more sheltered lives in home-like apartments under the kitchen, far removed from the risks and dangers of the dreaded house above. But there was a grating in the brick wall of the house, just below the floor level of the kitchen above, through which Ariadne could see the garden. A piece of graveled path and a bank where crocus bloomed in the spring, where blossom drifted from an unseen tree, and where later an azalea bush would flower, and where birds came and pecked and flitted and sometimes fought. "The hours you waste on them birds," Homily would say, "and when there's a little job to be done, you can never find the time. I was brought up in this house," Homily went on, "where there's no grating, and we were all the happier for it. Now, go off and get me the potato." That was the day when Ariadne, rolling the potato before her from the storehouse down the dusty lane under the floorboards, kicked it ill-temperedly so it rolled fast into their kitchen, where Homily was stooping over the stove. "There you go again," exclaimed Homily, turning and angrily. "Nearly pushed me into the soup. And when I say potato, I didn't mean the whole potato. Take the scissor, can't you, and cut off a slice." "Didn't know how much you wanted," grumbled Ariadne, and Homily, snorting and snuffing, unhooked the blade and handle of half a pair of manicure scissors from a nail on the wall and began to cut through the peel. "You've ruined this potato," she grumbled. "You can't roll it back down in all that dust. Not once has it been cut open." "Oh, what does it matter?" said Ariadne. "There are plenty more." "That's a nice way to talk. Plenty more. Do you realize what your poor father risks his life every time he borrows a potato?" "I meant," said Ariadne, "there are plenty more in the storeroom." "Well, out of my way now," said Homily, bustling around again. "Whatever you meant, and let me get the supper." Ariadne wandered through the open door into the sitting room. The fire had been lighted and the room looked bright and cozy. Homily was proud of her sitting room. The walls had been papered with scraps of old letters out of wastepaper baskets, and Homily had arranged the handwriting sideways on vertical strips, which ran from floor to ceiling. On the walls, repeated in various colors, hung several portraits of Queen Victoria as a girl. These were postage stamps borrowed by Pod some years ago from the stamp box on the desk in the morning room. There was a lacquer trinket box padded inside with the lid open, which they used as a settle, and useful standby, a chest of drawers made of matchboxes. There was a round table with a red velvet cloth, which Pod had made from wooden bottom of a pillbox, supported on the carved pedestal of a knight from the chess set. This had caused a great deal of trouble upstairs when Aunt Sophie's eldest son, on a flying midweek visit, had invited the vicar for a game after dinner. Rosa Pickhatchet, who was the housemaid at the time, gave in her notice. After she had left, other things were found to be missing, and no one was engaged in her place. From that time onwards, Mrs. Driver ruled supreme. The knight itself, its bust, so to speak, stood on a column in the corner, where it looked very fine and lent the air to the room which only a statuary could give. Beside the fire, in a tiled wooden bookcase, stood Ariadne's library. It was a set of those miniature volumes which the Victorians loved to print, but which Ariadne seemed to size of very large church Bibles. There was Bryce's Tom Thumb Gazetteer of the World, including the last census, Bryce's Tom Thumb Dictionary, with short explanations of scientific, philosophical, literary, and technical terms, Bryce's Tom Thumb edition of the Comedies of William Shakespeare, including a foreword on the author, another book whose pages were all blank called Memoranda, but last but not least, Ariadne's favorite, Bryce's Tom Thumb Diary and Proverb book, with a saying for each day of the year, and as a preface, the life story of a little man called General Tom Thumb, who married a girl called Mercy Lavinia Bump. There was an engraving of their carriage and a pair with the little horses the size of mice. Ariadne was not a Stupid girl, she knew that horses could not be as small as mice, but she did not realize that Tom Thumb, nearly 2 feet high, would seem a giant to a borrower. Ariadne had learned to read from these books and to write by leaning sideways and copying out the writings on the walls. In spite of this, she did not always keep her diary, although in most days she would take a book out for the sake of saying, which sometimes would comfort her. Today it said, "You may go farther and fare worse." And underneath, Order of Garter instituted 1348. She carried the book to the fire and sat down with her feet on the hob. "What are you doing, Ariadne?" called Homily from the kitchen. "Writing in my diary." "Oh," exclaimed Homily shortly. "What did you want?" asked Ariadne. She felt quite safe. Homily liked her to write. Homily encouraged any form of culture. Homily herself, poor ignorant creature, could not even say the alphabet. Nothing, said Homily crossly, banging away with pan lids. "It'll do later." Ariadne took out her pencil. It was a small white pencil with a piece of silk cord attached, which had come off of a dance program. But even so, in Ariadne's hand, it looked like a rolling pin. "Ariadne!" called Homily again from the kitchen. "Yes?" "Put a little something on the fire, would you?" Ariadne braced her muscles and heaved the book off her knees and stood it upright on the floor. They kept the fuel, a assorted stack of crumbling candle grease, in a pewter mustard pot, shoveled it out with a spoon. Ariadne trickled only a few grains, tilting the mustard spoon not to spoil the blaze. Then she stood there basking in its warmth. It was a charming fireplace, made by Ariadne's grandfather, with a cog's wheel from the stables, part of an old cinder press. The spokes of the cog's wheel stood out on the starry rays, and the fire itself nestled in the center. Above, there was a chimney piece made from a small brass funnel, inverted. This, at one time, belonged to an oil lamp which matched it, and which stood, in the old days, on the hall table upstairs. An arrangement of pipes from the spout of the funnel carried the fumes into the kitchen flues above. The fire was laid with matchsticks and fed with assorted slack, and, as it burned up, the iron would become hot, and Homily would simmer soup on the spokes of the silver thimble, and Ariadne would broil nuts. How cozy those winter evenings could be! Ariadne, her great book on her knees, sometimes reading aloud. Pod, at his last, he was a shoemaker and made button boots out of kid gloves, now alas only for his family, and Homily, quite at last, with her knitting. Homily knitted their jerseys and stockings on black-headed pins, and sometimes on darning needles. A great reel of silk or cotton would stand table-high beside her, and sometimes, if she pulled too sharply, the reel would tip up and roll away on the open door into the dusty passage beyond, and Ariadne would be sent after it to rewind it carefully as she rolled it back. The floor of the sitting room was carpeted with a deep red blotting paper, which was warm and cozy, and soaked up the spills. Homily would renew it at intervals when it became available upstairs. But since Aunt Sophie had taken to her bed, Mrs. Driver seldom thought of blotting paper, unless suddenly there were guests. Homily liked it under the floor. Water they had in plenty, hot and cold, thanks to Pod's father, who had tapped the pipes from the kitchen boiler. They bathed in a small tureen, which once had held a pâté de foie gras. When they had wiped out their bath, you were supposed to put the lid back to stop people putting things in it. The soap, too, a great cake of it, hung on a nail in the scullery, and they scraped little pieces off. Homily liked coal tar, but Pod and Ariadne preferred sandalwood. "What are you doing now, Ariadne?" called Homily from the kitchen. "Still writing in my diary." Once again, Ariadne took hold of the book and heaved it back on her knees. She licked the lead of her great pencil and started a moment, deep in thought. She allowed herself, when she did remember to write, one little line on each page, because she would never, of this she was sure, have another diary, And if she could get 20 lines on each page, the diary would last her 20 years. She had kept it for nearly 2 years already, and today, 22nd March, she read last year's entry. Mother Cross, she thought a little while longer, then at last put ditto marks under Mother and worried under Cross. What did you say you were doing, Ariete? Called Homily from the kitchen. Ariete closed the book. Nothing, she said. Then chop me up this onion. There's a good girl. Your father's late tonight. Chapter 3. Sighing, Ariete put away her diary and went into the kitchen. She took the onion ring from Homily and slung it lightly around her shoulders, while she foraged for a piece of razor blade. Really, Ariete, exclaimed Homily, not on your clean jersey. Do you want to smell like a bit bucket? Here, take the scissors. Ariete stepped through the onion ring as though it were a child's loop and began to chop it into segments. Your father's late, muttered Homily again, and it's my fault, as you might say. Oh dear, I wish I hadn't. Hadn't what? Asked Ariete, her eyes watering. She sniffed loudly and longed to rub her nose on her sleeve. Homily pushed back a thick lock of hair with a worried hand. She stared at Ariete absently. It's that teacup you broke, she said. But that was days ago, began Ariete, blinking her eyelids as she sniffed again. I know, it's not you, it's me. It's not the breaking that matters, it's what I said to your father. And what did you say to him? Well, I just said, there's the rest of the service, I said, up there, where it always was, in the counter cupboard in the schoolroom. I don't see anything bad in that, said Ariete, as one by one she dropped the pieces of onion into the soup. But it's a high cupboard, exclaimed Homily. You have to get up there by the curtain, and your father, at his age. She sat down suddenly on a metal-topped champagne cork. Oh, Ariete, I wish I'd never mentioned it. Don't worry, said Ariete. Papa knows what he can and can't do. She pulled a rubber-scent bottle cork out of the hole in the hot water pipe and let it trickle scalding drops fall into the tin lid of an aspirin bottle. She added cold again to wash her hands. Maybe, said Homily, but I went on about it so. That's a teacup. Your Uncle Heredity never drank a thing that wasn't out of a common acorn cup, and he had lived a ripe old age and had the strength to emigrate. My mother's family never had nothing but a little bone thimble which they shared around. But it's once you've had a teacup, if you see what I mean. Yes, said Ariete, drying her hands on a roller towel made out of surgical bandage. It's that curtain, cried Homily. He can't climb a curtain at his age, not by the baubles. With his pin he could, said Ariete. His pin! I led him into that one too. Take the hat pin, I told him, and tie a bit of the name tape at the head and pull yourself upstairs. It was to borrow an emerald watch from her bedroom for me to time the cooking. Homily's voice began to tremble. Your mother's a wicked woman, Ariete, wicked and selfish. That's what I am. You know what? Exclaimed Ariete suddenly. Homily brushed away a tear. No, she said wanly. What? I could climb the curtain. Homily rose up. Ariete, you dare stand there in cold blood and say a thing like that? But I could borrow. I know I could. Oh, gasped Homily, you wicked girl. How can you speak so? And she crumpled up again on the cork stool. So it's come to this, she said. Now, mother, please, begged Ariete. Now don't take on. But you don't see, Ariete, gasped Homily. She stared down at the table at a loss for words. Then, at last, she raised a haggard face. My poor child, she said, don't speak like that of borrowing. You don't know, and thank goodness you'll never know. She dropped her voice in a fearful whisper. What it's like upstairs. Ariete was silent. What it's like? She asked after a moment. Homily wiped her face on her apron and smoothed back her hair. Your Uncle Heredity began, Eglatina's father, and then she paused. Listen, she said. What's that? Echoing on the wood was a faint vibration, the sound of a distant click. Your father! Exclaimed Homily. Oh, look at me. Where's the comb? They had a comb, a little silver 18th century eyebrow comb from the cabinet in the drawing room upstairs. Homily ran it through her hair and rinsed her poor red eyes, and when Pod came in, she was smiling and smoothing down her apron. Chapter 4. Pod came in slowly, his sack on his back. He leaned his hat pin, with its dangling name tape, against the wall, and on the middle of the kitchen table he placed a doll's teacup. It was the size of a mixing bowl. Why, Pod, began Homily. Got the salsa too, he said. He swung down the sack and untied the neck. Here you are, he said, drawing out the saucer. Matches it. He had a round, currant, bunny sort of face. Tonight it looked flabby. Oh, Pod, said Homily, you look odd. Are you all right? Pod sat down. Oh, fair enough, he said. You went up the curtain, said Homily. Oh, Pod, you shouldn't have. It's shaking you. Pod made a strange face. His eyes swiveled round toward Arrietty. Homily stared up at him, her mouth open, and then she turned. Come along, Arrietty, she said briskly. You pop off to bed now like a good girl, and I'll bring you some supper. Oh, said Arrietty, can't I see the rest of the borrowings? Your father's got nothing now, only food. Off you pop to bed. You've seen the cup and saucer. Arrietty went off to the sitting room to put away her diary, and took some time fixing her candle on the upturned drawing pin which served as a holder. Whatever are you doing? Grumbled Homily. Give it here. There, that's the way. Now off to bed and fold your clothes, mind. Good night, Papa, said Arrietty, kissing his flat white cheek. Careful of the light, he said mechanically, and watched her with his round eyes until she had closed the door. Now, Pod, said Homily when they were alone, tell me, what is the matter? Pod looked at her blankly. I've been seen, he said. Homily put out a groping hand for the edge of the table. She gasped and lowered herself slowly to the stool. Oh, Pod! There was a silence between them. Pod stared at Homily, and Homily stared at the table. After a while, she raised her white face. Badly? Pod moved restlessly. I don't know how badly. I've been seen. Ain't that bad enough? Not one, said Homily, slowly, has ever been seen since Uncle Herendetti, and he was the first, they say, for 45 years. A thought struck her, and she gripped the table. It's no good, Pod. I won't emigrate. No one's asking you to, said Pod. To go and live like Herendetti and Lumpy in a badger set, and other side of the world, that's where they say it is, all among the earthworms. It's 2 fields away above the spinney, said Pod. Nuts, that's what they eat, and berries. I wouldn't wonder if they didn't eat mice. You've eaten mice yourself, Pod reminded her. All drops and fresh air, and the children growing up wild. Think of Arrietty, said Homily. Think of the way she's been brought up, an only child. She'd catch her death. It's different for Herendetti. Why? Said Pod. He's got 4. That's why, explained Homily. When you've got 4, they're brought up rough. But never mind that now. Who saw you? A boy, said Pod. A what? Exclaimed Homily, staring. A boy. Pod sketched out a rough shape in the air with his hands. You know, a boy. But there isn't. I mean, what sort of boy? I don't know what you mean, what sort of boy. A boy in a nightshirt. A boy, you know what a boy is, don't you? Yes, said Homily. Know what a boy is, but there hasn't been a boy not in this house these 20 years. Well, said Pod, there's one now. Homily stared at him in silence, and Pod met her eyes. Where did he see you? She asked at last. In the schoolroom. Oh, said Homily, when you was getting the cup. Yes, said Pod. Haven't you got eyes? Asked Homily. Couldn't you have looked first? There's never nobody in the schoolroom, and that's more there wasn't today, he went on.
Then where was he?
In the bed, in the night nursery or whatever it's called. That's where he was, sitting up in bed with the doors open.
Well, you should have looked in the nursery.
How could I? Halfway up the curtain, he said.
Is that where you was?
Yes.
With the cup?
Yes, I couldn't get up or down.
Oh, Pod,
wailed Homily. I should never have let you go, not at your age. Now look here, said Pod. Don't mistake me. I got up all right. Got up like a bird, as you might say, bubbles or no bubbles. But, he leaned toward her, afterwards, with the cup in my hand, if you can see what I mean, he picked it up off the table. See, it's heavy like. Can't hold it by the handle like this, but it drops or it droops, as you might say. You should take a cup like this in your two hands. A bit of cheese off the shelf, or an apple, well, I drop that. Give it a push and it falls, and I climbs down, at my own time picks it up. But with a cup, you see what I mean? And coming down, you've got to watch your feet, and as I say, some of the bubbles was missing, and you don't know what you could hold on to and not safely.
Oh, Pod, said Homily, her eyes full of tears. What did you do?
Well, said Pod, sitting back up again, he took the cup.
What do you mean? Asked Homily, aghast. Pod avoided her eyes.
Well, he'd been sitting up in bed there watching me. I'd been on the curtain a good 10 minutes because the hall clock had struck the quarter.
But what do you mean he took the cup?
Well, he got out of bed and there he was standing looking up. I'll take the cup, he said.
Oh, gasped Homily, her eyes staring. And you give it to him?
He took it, said Pod, ever so gentle, and then, when I was down, he gave it to me. Homily put her face in her hands. Now don't get off.
He might have cut you, suddenly Homily said in a stifled voice.
Yes, said Pod, but he just gave me the cup. Here you are, he said.
Homily raised her face. What are we going to do? She asked.
Pod sighed. Well, there isn't nothing we can do, except...
Oh, no, exclaimed Homily. Not that. Not emigrate. Not that, Pod. Now I've got the house so nice and a clock and all.
We could take the clock, said Pod.
And Ariette, what about her? She's not like those cousins. She can read, Pod, and sew and
He don't know where we live, said Pod.
But they look, exclaimed Homily. Remember her and Daddy? They got a cat and...
Now, said Pod. Don't bring up the past.
But you've got to think of it. They got the cat and...
Yes, but Eglantine was different.
How different? She was Ariette's age.
Well, they hadn't told her, you see. That's where they went wrong. They tried to make her believe that there was nothing but there was under the floor. They never told her about Mrs. Driver or Crampford, least of all about cats.
There wasn't any cat, Homily pointed out, not till Ariette was seen.
Well, there was then, said Pod. You've got to tell them, that's what I say, or they try to find out themselves.
Pod, said Homily solemnly, we haven't told Ariette.
Oh, she knows, said Pod. He moved uncomfortably. She's got her grating.
She doesn't know about Eglatina. She doesn't know about being seen.
Well, said Pod, we'll tell her. We always said we would. There's no hurry.
Homily stood up. Pod, she said, we're going to tell her now. All right, that's where we're going to end for today. But I have a couple discussion questions to ask about our 4 chapters. First, what city is this set in? Do you remember? Talked about it at the beginning. The story is set in London. Do you know what country that's in? England. Where did Mrs. May live when she was a child? She lived in India when she was a child, and she was saying that when her and her family came back, her brother got sick, and that's when he went out to the countryside. What happened to Pod in our story that made him so upset? What happened? He had been seen. Ah. The little boy, who was Mrs. May's brother, the little boy saw him. Oh boy. What does immigrate mean? It usually means to leave a country and go to another, to immigrate and like move. So yes, for us, we would go a whole country, but she was kind of talking about just, Harriet was talking about just moving one field over, and that was big enough for her, right? So Mrs. May tells this as a story when she and her brother were little. So is this called history, foreshadowing, or a flashback? What do you think? Do you know those terms? In a book like this, it's called a flashback. So she is remembering things that occurred before in her life, or she was told in this aspect. What was different about the lights that Mrs. Driver lit in Great Aunt Sophie's house from the lights that we have today? Let's see if I can find the picture. Do you remember? What is so different about those? So you can look kind of here, there at the top. It doesn't have electricity. It has oil, and they use gas as well. So instead of electricity running through the house, they had gas, and you would turn it down to make the light dimmer or turn it off rather than flip a switch with the electricity we have. So how tall do you think Arietti is? How tall do you think Arietti is? Well, she and the person narrating described something that's 2 feet. So this is about 1 foot. So 2 feet, as a giant to Arietti. So I'm guessing she is very, very small. Like, she's even smaller than her dad, and her dad looked pretty small when we saw her or him in this picture with Mrs. May's brother, right? Sorry, that doesn't focus very well. There we go. So he's this little guy right there, kind of bigger than a mouse. All right, one more question. What is Homily like? What is she like? Well, she seems to worry a lot, doesn't she? And kind of, she talked about how she's kind of selfish because she wanted certain things and she doesn't want to move even though they could be in danger. Lots of different things. But she seems to care a lot about her family, doesn't she? She really wants to make sure that they are safe. Well, we're going to see what happens next in The Borrowers in our next chapter book read along. I hope to see you all there. Bye, everyone.